The cameras were not working, the guards failed to follow protocol, and one of the most important prisoners in the world was left completely alone, in a place where that should have been impossible. And by the time morning came, Jeffrey Epstein was dead, inside a high-security prison, under circumstances that immediately raised more questions than answers. Because this was not just any inmate, this was a man connected to billionaires, politicians, celebrities, and some of the most powerful individuals on the planet, a man whose testimony could have changed everything, and yet, he died before that could ever happen. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but from the very beginning, people started asking one simple question: how does something like this happen, in a system that is designed to prevent it? Because when multiple failures happen at the same time, when cameras stop working, when guards ignore procedures, and when critical details are missing, it stops looking like coincidence, and starts feeling like something else entirely. To understand why this case became one of the most controversial stories in modern history, we have to go back, long before that night, to the beginning of a life that never fully made sense. Jeffrey Epstein did not come from extreme wealth, he was not born into power, and there was nothing in his early life that clearly suggested he would one day become connected to some of the most influential people in the world. And yet, somehow, he managed to enter circles that are normally impossible to access, building relationships with individuals whose decisions shape economies, politics, and global influence. What makes this even more unusual is that there was never a clear explanation for how he accumulated his wealth. There was no widely known company, no public empire, and no obvious source that could justify the level of luxury in which he lived. As time passed, Epstein's lifestyle became more visible, revealing a world of private jets, exclusive properties, and access to locations far removed from public attention. He owned residences in some of the most expensive cities in the world, including New York and Paris, as well as a private island, a place that would later become one of the most discussed elements of his story. But what truly stood out was not just the wealth, but the people who surrounded him, because among his connections were politicians, business leaders, and public figures whose influence extended far beyond their own countries. These were individuals who carefully protected their reputation, and yet, they chose to spend time with him, to travel with him, and to maintain a relationship that would later raise serious questions. And this is where the story begins to shift, because behind the image of wealth and influence, there were allegations, stories that described something far darker than the public initially understood. These were not isolated claims, but repeated accounts that suggested a pattern, something that had been happening over a long period of time, hidden beneath layers of power, money, and silence. What made these allegations even more disturbing was the way they were handled, because despite their seriousness, there was no immediate collapse of Epstein's life, no sudden removal from the circles he occupied. Instead, he continued to live in a way that suggested protection, or at the very least, a system that was not reacting as quickly as many expected. Over time, pressure began to build, more people started to speak, more attention was drawn to the case, and the situation slowly became impossible to ignore. The story that once existed on the edges of public awareness began to move into the center, attracting media coverage, investigations, and increasing scrutiny. And eventually, that pressure reached a point where action could no longer be delayed, authorities were forced to respond, and Epstein was finally arrested. This moment marked a turning point, because for the first time, it seemed that the case might fully unfold, that more information might become public, and that questions which had remained unanswered for years, might finally be addressed. After his arrest, Jeffrey Epstein was placed inside a federal detention center, a facility designed to hold individuals considered high risk, and to ensure constant monitoring. This was not an ordinary situation, because Epstein was not an ordinary inmate. He was a high-profile prisoner, whose case had drawn global attention, and whose safety was expected to be handled with extreme care. According to standard procedures, inmates in similar conditions are subject to regular checks, surveillance, and strict supervision, all designed to prevent incidents such as self-harm. And yet, despite these measures, despite the systems in place, something would go wrong, something that would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. On the night of August 9th, leading into the early hours of August 10th, the system that was supposed to ensure safety and control began to fail in ways that should not have been possible. The guards responsible for monitoring the area did not perform their duties as required. Instead of checking on inmates at regular intervals, significant periods of time passed without any supervision. At the same time, the surveillance cameras, which should have recorded every movement, were reported to be malfunctioning, leaving critical gaps in what should have been a complete record of events. And Epstein, who should have been under constant observation, was left alone, without the level of monitoring that someone in his position required. When morning arrived, the situation had already unfolded. Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell, and within a short period of time, he was declared dead. The official conclusion stated that the cause of death was suicide, a result that brought immediate closure from a procedural standpoint, but not from a public perspective. Because for many people, the explanation did not match the circumstances. The combination of failures, the timing, and the lack of clear evidence created a situation that felt incomplete. And when a case of this magnitude feels incomplete, it does not end, it evolves, turning into questions, theories, and ongoing debate. Some explanations pointed toward negligence, suggesting that what happened was the result of a system under pressure, with overworked staff, procedural failures, and a chain of mistakes that aligned in the worst possible way. Others considered a different possibility, that Epstein's death prevented further information from being revealed, including details that could have had serious consequences for individuals connected to him. While there is no confirmed evidence supporting such claims, the lack of transparency, and the number of unanswered questions, allowed these theories to continue growing. Because when people do not receive clear answers, they begin to search for them elsewhere. And perhaps that is what makes this case so enduring, not only the events themselves, but the absence of clarity, the feeling that something important remains unresolved. Because in the end, we are left with a story that has an official conclusion, but not universal acceptance, a case that is closed, but not fully understood. Jeffrey Epstein is gone, but the questions remain, and they continue to raise one final thought. If everything had worked the way it was supposed to, if every system had functioned correctly, and if every procedure had been followed, would this story have ended the same way?